Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Calvin Coolidge, and the focus is foreign affairs. Typically, the focus in the Coolidge administration is domestic affairs. It's where he spent most of his time and energy focusing on the economy, cutting taxes, cutting spending, things along those lines. Foreign affairs is pretty foreign to Calvin Coolidge. He had no experience in this area prior to becoming President of the United States. He relied heavily on his Secretaries of State, Charles Evans Hughes and Frank Kellogg, to help him through many of these challenging issues. But one of the things he did at the very beginning of his administration was to make clear that the United States was not going into the League of Nations. Now, this was a topic that dated back to the Wilson presidency, Woodrow Wilson, his vision of this League of Nations. He got the rest of the world to adopt it, but the United States Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, rejected the League of Nations covenant, and when Warren Harding became president, he continued that policy. No entry into the League. For Calvin Coolidge, again, no change. He made it clear in his first annual message to Congress. Our country has definitely refused to adopt and ratify the covenant of the League of Nations. We have not felt warranted in assuming the responsibilities which its members have assumed. I am not proposing any change in this policy, and neither is the Senate. The incident, so far as we are concerned, is closed. The League exists as a foreign agency. We hope it will be helpful. But the United States sees no reason to limit its own freedom and independence of action by joining it. Case closed on the League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles had gone into effect for the rest of the world about 3 years, a little over 3 years by the time Calvin Coolidge became president, and there was already problems brewing in Europe, particularly starting with Germany and their, frankly, inability to pay the massive reparations that had been imposed on them by the Allies in the Treaty of Versailles. Now, part of the problem was what was going on in the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley had been German property prior to World War I. It was a critical element of natural resources for coal and steel production that came out of the Ruhr Valley that helped fuel the German economy. Well, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles reassigned the Ruhr Valley to France. Now, they wanted preferential treatment, which was hurting the German economy and the ability for the Germans to actually make money so they could pay off those reparations. Then all of a sudden, the German industrialists in the Ruhr Valley who were still running these mines and these factories started prioritizing shipments back to Germany, raising prices for the rest of Europe. That wasn't going to stand for the Allies. France and Germany reoccupied with military force the Ruhr Valley, and Germany once again was in trouble economically. Well, France and Britain were also in trouble because they were struggling to pay off the billions of dollars in loans back to the United States. In fact, they thought the United States should just forgive those loans. After all, they had suffered a lot more during World War I than the Americans had. But for this, Calvin Coolidge was a firm no. The money we furnished, we had to borrow, he said. Someone must pay it. It cannot be canceled. But Coolidge was okay to perhaps negotiating more favorable terms for the British and the French and the other allies to pay back those loans. Well, an international committee was formed and an American was put in the lead, Charles Dawes, a former banker who had also served as the comptroller of the currency. He had volunteered to serve during World War I and was a key member of General Pershing's staff for the Americans, and now he was basically put in charge of a committee to try to fix all of the economic woes in Europe. Well, he started by renegotiating with the Allies, better interest rates to pay off those loans to the Americans, and extend the period to pay them back. 62 years they would now have to pay, putting Britain and France in a much better position to actually help their own economies and still pay back the Americans. So all good there. What about the Germans, though? Well, Dawes and his committee went to the American private sector, which was booming. The financial sector in the United States was doing really well, so he got a syndicate, J.P. Morgan, Dillon Reed, some other firms, to loan at pretty reasonable rates $200 million to the Germans. So how did this work? The Germans would borrow money from the private sector in the United States, use that money to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain would use that money to pay back the United States government, and everybody seemed to be happy as long as the U.S. economy, which was fueling a lot of this, was still going well. Charles Dawes, for his work, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize as things were calming on the economic front in Europe. What about back in North America? Well, throughout this period, the Americans had been having trouble with its southern border neighbor of Mexico. And this goes back to the Wilson administration again, around 1916, when there was a civil war going on in in Mexico, and the Americans were trying to figure out whose side to take. Well, Pancho Villa was one of the leaders in Mexico who was kind of on the outs, and he was not happy about it. And he, in fact, invaded the United States, a cross-border raid into Columbus, New Mexico. This, again, creating a lot of tension between the United States and Mexico. Well, the Americans initially did recognize the government in Mexico of Victoriano Carranza. He then turned things over to Alvaro Obregon, who became the president of Mexico. And when Coolidge became president, he recognized the Obregon government in 1923. In fact, he shipped arms to the Obregon government as Obregon was trying to quell his own rebellion that was going on during his administration. Well, there was a pretty big change in policy from the Mexican government, a nationalistic change in policy around this same time, where the Mexicans decided that they were going to retake lands that had been sold to foreign entities, particularly oil companies, particularly those in the United States. Now, the American oil companies cried foul. They said, look, we had contracts, we signed and we paid for these lands. They wanted the American government to do something about this. Well, the next iteration of the Mexican government came in under Plutaro in 1925. And again, he's doubling down on this new nationalistic policy for Mexico, people pressuring Calvin Coolidge. What's he going to do about perhaps these contract violations of American oil companies in Mexico? Well, he said, now look at this. Look on the other side of the picture. Here we are, the most powerful nation in the world. At this moment, we have special representatives in Europe, as well as all of our diplomats urging reduction of armaments and preaching peace. The world of today would harshly condemn us if, despite our attitude, we should go to war with a neighbor nation not nearly our equal. What do you suppose people in years to come would say? Powerful United States crushing powerless Mexico? Don't you think it's better for us to find another way to handle the situation? So he doesn't want to go to war, but he still needs to solve this problem, this economic problem for American companies. Well, he thought he needed better diplomacy. The fact was that James Sheffield, his current ambassador to Mexico, was kind of hostile to the Calle government. Things were not going well there. But Coolidge was trying to figure out, well, who would be better? Who could he get? Well, his buddy Frank Stearns made a recommendation. Why don't you go with your former classmate from Amherst, Dwight Morrow? Now, Morrow had been selected as the most likely to succeed in Coolidge's class at Amherst back in 1895, but Coolidge actually got one vote most likely to succeed. And you know who that was? From Dwight Morrow. So he had a lot of respect for him. Coolidge had a lot of respect for Morrow, but they kind of had gone their separate ways. They were not close in their post-Amherst days. In fact, Morrow had made a name for himself, rising up the food chain in the J.P. Morgan community as a partner in their financial management organization, doing extremely well for himself. He and Coolidge had sort of maintained modest touch to each other, but they had not been close. But he highly respected, and when Stearns recommended Morrow to be the ambassador to Mexico, Coolidge jumped at the chance, and he was thrilled when Morrow agreed to serve. What about his guidance? Well, Coolidge, again, very simple when he gave guidance to subordinates. In this case, it was simple. My only instructions are to keep us out of war with Mexico. Pretty simple. Well, Morrow had a new style compared to his predecessor, Sheffield. He went into Mexico kind of a conciliatory mood, power of personal persuasion, unusual frankness actually as well, which was appreciated by President Calle. They struck a pretty decent relationship and they struck a deal, the Calle-Morrow Agreement. Here's what they came up with. Contracts prior to 1917 would remain valid. If American oil companies had made purchases of Mexican land prior to 1917, there would be no change. After that period, well, Mexico was going to take back that land. They would continue to have opportunities to lease it to foreign governments, but they drew a line in the sand at least to grandfather in those purchases prior to 1917. Now, not everybody was happy about this. After all, it was 6-7 years later after that original date had been picked, but still, this was a stabilizing effort. Most people got on board, adapted to the new rules, and again, a war was avoided. So, as far as Calvin Coolidge was concerned, this was success by Dwight Morrow in Mexico. Now, a little bit further south, Nicaragua in Central America. The United States had been involved in peacekeeping efforts in Nicaragua for years, and Calvin Coolidge, though, made a change to that. He removed the U.S. Marines in 1925. What happened? Immediately, things destabilized again. General Adolpho Diaz took over in in Nicaragua, but he had a rebellion that was going on under his watch, and he actually went back to the United States, went back to President Coolidge, and asked for those Marines to come back in to help stabilize the situation. Well, Coolidge agreed, but he added something to the mix as well. He sent in the Marines, brought some peacekeeping forces into place, but he also sent a former Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, in as his special envoy to try to negotiate a settlement in Nicaragua. Well, he was successful. He negotiated a ceasefire, a return of prisoners, and agreement for elections to take place the following year. In fact, the American-backed Diaz lost the election to Jose Moncada. The United States was fine with that. They accepted the results of the Nicaraguan people. And again, as Moncada took over the presidency, things became more stable in Nicaragua. January of 1928, for Coolidge, a rarity. He took a trip outside the United States. He went to Cuba. This was the opening of a Pan-American conference in Cuba. Thousands lining the streets to actually welcome the American president. He made some remarks, a brief speech at the beginning of the event, but it was really former Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes who was leading the American delegation in the meetings. Not a lot came out of this conference. There was an agreement that they would use arbitration to resolve disputes between members going forward, so that had some modest benefits. Not a lot coming out, but again, a rarity for Coolidge just to step foot on foreign soil. Now, Warren Harding had negotiated for the United States and the world the most far-reaching arms reduction control treaty ever. Calvin Coolidge, though, wanted even more arms reduction because in some areas they were not included in the Harding negotiated treaty. Submarines, for example, destroyers, they were not included in arms reduction, and Coolidge wanted to attack those. So we got Britain and Japan to agree to meet in Geneva, Switzerland to talk about this, but frankly things were not going that well. The Americans and the British were at odds on some of the details of any potential agreement. France and Italy, they weren't going at all. They did not participate. France actually had some other ideas on sort of this grand scheme of international diplomacy. Their French premier, Aristide had introduced to the American audience in April of 1927 the notion that it was time for a denunciation of war as national policy. Denunciation of war as national policy. Well, he soon formally proposed that in a bilateral agreement to the United States government. It got kind of a cool reception in the United States. People weren't really sure what even this meant. How would it be enforced? What were the implications of such a statement? Well, over time, Senator William Borah took up the mantle of this in the United States. He thought it was a good idea. He was promoting it to Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, who started to come on board as well. But Kellogg's vision wasn't a bilateral agreement just with France. What good would that do? He thought this might have an impact if all the nations of the world would actually sign on to this. And that's what he proposed to Calvin Coolidge, and Coolidge agreed. In fact, they agreed. They only had about a year left in the administration. Let's not waste time going back and forth with France on this. Let's just put out our proposal and see if the world would adopt it. And that's what they did. In December of 1927, announced a very similar proposal that Briand had brought to the United States to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. They invited all the nations of the world to join. Calvin Coolidge certainly on board. It does not supersede our inalienable sovereign right and duty of national defense or undertake to commit us before the event to any mode of action which the Congress might decide to be wise if ever the treaty should be broken. So no concerns here like there was over perhaps loss of sovereignty in the League of Nations covenant. And Calvin Coolidge and his ambassadors were deciding to see how can we push this forward with the rest of the world sign on. Well, it picked up some steam. France agreed. Great Britain, Italy, Japan, even Germany signed on to the process. And when nations gathered in Paris to sign the Kellogg-Brian Pact in August of 1928, another 9 more countries on top of those had joined. By the time it went into effect the next year, 30 more countries were on board. Now, some people actually ridiculed this agreement. They said, how is it going to be enforced? How practical was it? Carter Glass was a senator from Virginia who made the statement, I'm not willing that anybody in Virginia shall think I am simple enough to suppose that it is worth a postage stamp in the direction of accomplishing permanent peace. Nevertheless, Carter Glass voted for it when the Senate voted for it, because why not? It couldn't hurt. In fact, the Senate voted 85-1 to agree and confirm the Kellogg-Briand Pact. hardly eliminated war, but yet it was a stake in the ground in that direction. People felt positive about this around the world, and Frank Kellogg was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Well, in general, under Calvin Coolidge, foreign affairs seemingly relatively modest, but look, entire time he was in office, the Americans were at peace with the world. He did negotiate a couple of major treaties that actually ended up delivering 2 Nobel Peace Prizes to the United States. The only other president who oversaw actions that sponsored by the American government that led to 2 Nobel Peace Prizes during his administration, other than Calvin Coolidge, was Harry Truman. And that was it. So while Coolidge did most of his work in the domestic affairs, he also had some things to be proud of in foreign affairs. That is Foreign Affairs and Calvin Coolidge. From the life of Calvin Coolidge, for more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.